Hello everyone, it is Tuesday again, and we are having a couple of issues today that we will look at. The red ones first, and then I think we'll tackle a few more depending on how we are doing with time, because the last times we usually took way too long and didn't actually finish more than 3 items. So let's start with this one here. I think Tomasz is the one that wants to talk about this, right?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep. We can hear you. Except not anymore.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, just fine.
Okay, sorry. I'm in kind of troublesome spot, so everything is miserable and I dial in. So this one is somewhat similar or related to what we discussed before. Part of the trouble is that the socket address lives in different assembly than sockets. So the sockets code does a lot of weird stuff, and this is both an attempt to make the socket address more useful, but also to clean up internally in sockets and basically get to a point that we don't need to use internal socket address and clean up all of weird and complicated code. So there are two parts of this. One is the bare bone minimum to basically be able to use the socket address natively in socket address. And for that, we need to have access to the underlying buffer, which the proposal is to expose it as a memory of byte. And we also need to be able to set the size, like we discussed before, to pass in socket address with some big enough buffer, you receive something, and then we basically need to shrink it down to whatever address was actually received. So we need to basically set the size on the socket address as well. And so that's the bare bone minimum we would need to basically be able to efficiently use socket address in sockets and also make it somewhat useful for people who would use the new interface we discussed last week.
And Tomasz, this minimal API addition is sufficient for us to stop building the custom version of socket address into systemnet sockets, right?
Correct, because what happens is once I have the spent T or memory T of the bytes, I can do static methods, I can do extensions, I can do whatever. And basically the socket address is already mutable. The problem is it's only mutable through basically the indexes, and that's really, really inconvenient API to do that. We would need to copy bytes one by one, and basically, yes, Steve, as you said, if we expose this minimal set, we can get rid of the internal implementation and the duality of the socket address.
Yeah, I like that a lot, both from the perspective of not having this really weird setup where we build it as internal with a different name into the assembly and duplicate it, and also from the perspective that we really shouldn't be special in terms of being able to use what is effectively just a byte array that's wrapped in a class, and anyone should be able to do the same thing that socket can do with it. So I like basically just exposing it.
The socket buffer right now, it's also, the proposal is to make it settable. We don't really need it, and I've been debating, and we had some discussion with Anton whether we need it or not. I was thinking we might do experiments with prepend buffers, or you can write a wrapper around native memory, but that's not really needed. So one option is either to skip the setting the socket buffer and only keep it as a getter, or we can approve it if we feel it will be useful, but in idle we might not implement it, and we can do that in the future. It's really running out of time, so there'd be one way how to make it kind of bit smaller. I don't know if you care one way or the other.
I would skip the setter unless we have really. We can always add it later, unless we have.
Yeah, we don't at this moment. So basically,
what about the setter
on the size?
Sorry, I was going to ask. What about the setter on size? How do we use that?
So what happens is you pass a maximum buffer to, let's say, the receive call. You receive either IPv4 or IPv6, or let's say you have socket Unix domain socket. You need a buffer which is big enough to hold the address, but you don't know the file name exactly up front. So basically, when you receive, we need to shrink it to actually how many bytes was received, and we get that information from the native API call. So
do we also
be able to shrink
do
it
we
down.
grow it if we set size to a larger value? Does it then grow the buffer?
It doesn't right now, and I think we don't need it in a pattern how we use it.
Why is that? If I create one of these that's sized for IPv4 and an IPv6 packet arrives, what do we do?
We would basically fail, and basically, if you cannot receive IPv6 address on an IPv4 address family, so if you always create socket address for the family of socket you're receiving on, you should be just fine. So IPv6 sockets in dual mode can there's really no useful use case, I think, to make it bigger. I mean, we could, but it would create a lot of complications of skills. So I felt that.
I see. You're saying that if you're going to be receiving on an IPv6 connection, you create an IPv6 socket address, and then if you end up receiving an IPv4 packet on that connection, we would sort of change the visible size, but it wouldn't change the internal buffer.
Correct.
And we wouldn't have the opposite case of receiving an IPv6 packet on an IPv4 connection, because that doesn't happen. Oh, there's no connection though.
Correct. Correct.
So I guess I'm still not clear. How does this work in UDP world if there's no connection? So can't I issue a receive from and end up getting an IPv6 packet even though I supplied a socket address that was IPv4?
Well, if the socket itself is IPv6, then yes, you can. If the socket itself is IPv4, you cannot. So regardless whether there's a connection or not, it all goes back to type of address family of the socket socket you're receiving on.
So will we fail the receive from call immediately without even doing any work if we see that the socket address is incompatible?
I don't think we would know. I mean, we can bolt the checks in there for the address family, but we don't know. We don't any kind of prototype.
But if we don't do that, wouldn't that then potentially result in data loss? Because it wouldn't be until we actually got the packet that we would know that we had to fail?
Yes. That's correct. And as I said, we can bolt in the check. So we can say the address family of the socket address must be the same as address family of the socket. And we can do exception for the dual mode sockets that we would also allow IPv4 if you choose to.
Oh yeah, I think it's fine not to do the growing as long as we do the checking up front. I think the worst case would be if we didn't do any checking, we didn't do any growing, and we threw an exception when a packet arrived that wasn't compatible, because then that packet gets thrown away.
Yeah, I can write a test for it also. So if we want to be sure about the behavior, it'll be easy to test.
Okay.
So then what does it mean for the API? Should we remove the setter for the buffer, but we keep the setter for the size?
I think so, yeah.
Yes.
And presumably this, and either based on Tomas's, whatever he implements and experiments with, either the setter for the size throws if you try and grow it beyond the buffer that it has, or it grows the buffer based on what's deemed appropriate. Is that right, Tomas?
Yes, essentially.
So is the memory it returns back capped by size, or can it exceed size?
It can exceed size. So when the constructor you pass in address family, it would allocate buffer for you automatically, and it would set the size to the size of the buffer.
Okay, that I was just trying to understand the usability. If the buffer is the raw buffer, then and you can set size to be any slice up to the end of the buffer, then that seems fine.
And so basically to use the buffer's populated with data. For it to be meaningful, you have to slice it by 0, size, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right, unless you're writing to it, in which case you
right.
write to it and then tell size what the new slice boundary is.
Yep. Yeah. It's basically a socket encode. I don't expect external users to actually do that, but obviously they could do all kinds of stuff.
Is socket buffer the right name for that property?
I do not know, so we call it buffer in the internal implementation.
I think I would just call it buffer. Socket buffer is strange to me. It sounds like it's somehow a buffer for a socket.
That would be fine. yeah, that would be even better.
Do we want that as a get property or a get prefixed method?
Why would it be a method? Isn't it cheap to return the memory?
I don't know. Do we care about it showing up in a debugger? Do we care about it looking as friendly as a property?
I mean, most of the time we return those as properties, I think, right?
I think property would be probably easy to work with, and again, it only wraps a buffer under, so there's nothing really interesting in the socket address itself. And so really goes back to, can you look at the bytes?
Socket address really is just a strongly typed wrapper around a byte array, right?
Yep.
I mean, buffer seems fine to me. I mean,
what does the equatable implementation do?
It basically does, essentially it does sequence equal on the byte array.
Up to the size.
Up to the size, correct.
And some
right now
hash
it's
code
gonna be a recache, and and we do all kinds of like custom hash code. I plan to basically get rid of it once we unify it, and basically it will be hash of the byte array, and comparison will be sequence or sequence equal on the span.
Presumably it does the same thing that the existing override for equals already does, right? You just add the interface to it, right? Is that fair?
I think mostly yes.
Well, I mean, I think we should be, like, it seems weird to me to change the semantics, right? I mean, I think it's fine to say you can now also use it strongly typed, and you can also use it with the interface, but I think if there's an existing equals semantics, I don't think we should change it.
No, the semantics will stay. What I'm saying, go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, yeah, I'm just looking at it now. You're right, Emo. It's exactly what it has an override of equals and get hash code. That's exactly what you said.
Yeah, then that seems fine.
This just makes it strongly typed.
Yeah.
I'm looking to see if we said don't make a mutable type BI equatable.
I don't know that we would say that, considering it doesn't add anything it doesn't already have. But I do question: do we generally make classes equatable, since their default implementation is basically? I generally think of us doing this on structs. Do we do it on reference types?
Well, for value types, we have the guideline that says do implement equatable.
Right. For value types, it avoids boxing.
Right. And then for reference types, we seem to not care.
I mean, I guess it's only applicable if you have a constraint somewhere, right?
Yeah. So the way how this is used, it's in a socket code. So when you receive address, it would compare if it's the same as it was before, and if it's not, it would allocate new endpoint. But we can do that also internally, and also the equals already exists on the socket address, so it's only making it sort of formally official that you can do equals.
Yeah, and actually later we say consider implementing equatable if you override object equals.
All right, seems fine.
Which we did.
And Tomas, there's currently caching. Are you going to remove that caching?
I was planning to, yes, because it seems unnecessary.
Yeah.
And just adds complications,
and dangerous
also,
once the buffer is exposed.
Right, exactly. And it's basically only perf sort of impact, so there should be no functional impact. So are we ready to talk about the second half?
So that was the second half?
Received from that we punted last time.
No. It's the second half of the same thing. So basically,
Ah.
right now we give it a buffer, and a socket code itself internally has methods how to, for example, extract port or address from the buffer itself. So you can do logging, you can do hashing, you can do lookups, you can do all kinds of other stuff. And I consider this as nice to have. So there are basically helper functions to find bits and pieces of useful information in the buffer, which is platform specific. So if we don't do this, people would need to implement their own things if they, for example, want to get IP address from the buffer without allocations. You can always create endpoint from the socket buffer, but then it basically allocates, it does a bunch of allocations. So I was thinking about useful helper functions to give you the basic information about what is in the buffer.
I mean,
do we know that
to be,
it seems reasonable as well, but do we know that others need this? I mean, we do have some special needs in SystemNet sockets.
Yeah. There was one case for the Unity gaming mirroring project that basically they receive a packet from somewhere and they try to find a connection ID to look up the player. So right now they use get hash code to find sort of the matching entry, which seems fishy to me, but that's what they currently do. So technically they don't need to get the actually IP address, but I thought it'd be nice to have. So again, that's one reason why I split it. We don't have strong evidence that it's needed. And again, once you have the access to memory for the socket code, we can implement all the functions we need as a static extension methods, which are internal.
Isn't Unity miles far away from migrating to .NET 8? By the way, as far as I know, they are really stuck with .NET Standard and .NET Standard 2.
Yeah, I don't know.
1.
There might be others, right? So there were a bunch of people interested. This is the most upvoted issue in networking. And I picked 2 projects of people who've been really active. So there was a guy who wrote a DNet server, and there was somebody who, or even for logging, right? Let's say you want to log what you receive. It'd still be nice if you can, for example, extract the IP address and port. But as I said, this is optional, and there's no strong evidence this is really needed. We can hunt it, and we can edit later if we need to.
What does one do with what does one do with the int128 address? How would you convert that? Can you convert that to an IP address somehow?
You would need to specify it as a byte, and then we have constructor for IP address, which takes bytes.
But so IP address is itself a non-heap allocated type. Why don't you just out the IP address?
It's not. You're looking at the internal one, Jeremy.
No. Thank you for your omniscience there, Steve.
Yeah, I've done that many, many times. Because it comes up as the first entry in source.net, like the interrupt IP address. Yeah.
SystemNet primitives IP address. And then I stopped looking. So,
Demat, you basically do like new span with the address and then as bytes, and then you pass that in, and that would work. Like the bytes would be in the right place.
Right. Or in case of, let's say, you want to look up your player number, right? You have a number you can have in your own structures. You don't need to create IP address itself. Or for debugging, you can just log it as a hex number, so you know at least what are you receiving from, right? You don't necessarily need the full-blown fancy type. You just need to have the information, what it is.
And I see. And that
So
this
those
would
are
be
really convenience functions. Yeah, go ahead.
Try get address and try get port are just effectively slicing the buffer to the right place and then reinterpret casting. Is that how that works?
Yeah, essentially we have a pull functions which do that, and I think for, let's say, Unix domain sockets, the address would be the file name itself, so it would slice on the bytes holding the file name
But that wouldn't work with try get like for a Unix domain socket, try get address would return false, I assume.
I forget. There was one which returned span, doesn't it? Or did I? I don't remember. I don't see the computer screen. Sorry. So.
Oh, sorry. What's on the screen says bool try get address out int 128 address out long scope ID. There's no way to.
Oh, I see. So, yeah. So this one would not work for Unix domain socket.
Yeah.
Wasn't there another overload for getting the address?
There's one that's try write address bytes, span byte destination out in bytes written.
Oh, I see. So that one might work. So you still will be able to use this one to extract the file name, the raw file name, if you care.
Yeah, and what does IPv4 do in the 128 model? A bunch of leading zeros?
It will just give you, yes, essentially.
And scope ID 0?
Scope ID 0, yes.
Couldn't we just get rid of the confusion and merge them, and you get try write address bytes, span destination out bytes written out long scope ID?
We could, the thing is that you need to stack alloc and do all kinds of dancing around it, but from performance perspective and functional perspective, that would be equal.
Right, but you said that anybody who wants to actually do anything with the int 128 address then needs to memory marshal, get bytes, and then pass that to like IP address. So it seems like just saying we're going to give you the bytes. You can do with that what you will. You can interpret it as int 128 and log it. You can pass exactly the indicated span slice into IP address.
That's fair. Yes, that's fair. And I think we do have IP address which takes byte array or bytes span of bytes as a constructor. So you could do even for IPv4. The int is just nice to work with, but again, it's I think the bytes would be more universal.
Oh, actually, it looks like yes. Now that I'm in class IP address, the constructor that takes read-only span of byte throws if you don't give it a buffer that's as long as an IPv6 address.
Oh, I see.
It straight up assumes it's IPv6.
Yeah.
So I mean, like if we do complicated things like, it seems like maybe it's try get IPv4 address, try get IPv6 address, try write address. Like, I think this needs more work. Try get port seems nice though.
Yeah. So why don't we just get the address, try get address, and then worry about the other family, because then IPv8 comes along or whatever, and again, this one could work also strings them in sockets, and at least you could get the address out and do whatever you want to. As you said, you can use binary primitives to turn it into int if you want to. I think it'd be easy.
So you were saying just get rid of try get address and try get port and just have try write address bytes, that one?
And I would keep the port, I think, because the port, it's useful for IP protocols, and that's majority of the use case.
I mean, I had suggested getting rid of try get address and just making it be merging it with try write address bytes and let somebody figure out what they're supposed to do with a scope ID if they're IPv4 or Unix domain socket. But the IP address constructor isn't friendly to anything other than IPv6 according to that particular method signature.
Yeah. So as I said, you could.
I mean, we could fix the IP address constructor, but
right.
Well, like this is just you're taking a thing and you're trying to make it easier for someone to log it, but now they need to be as smart as you in networking in order to understand how to even touch the data that came back. Which seems like they may as well have just read buffer.
Well, if you don't have a skills, right, they can use the overloads with remote address or remote endpoint, and don't even get to this business about sort of the low-level socket APIs. That'd be the natural stuff, right? That's all the example shows. You say receive from, you give it reference to endpoint, you get endpoint back, and you have all the information you need in convenient form.
Right, and I guess actually it's in particular if you call the IP address constructors that take a scope ID, they get angry if you're not IPv6 because that's the only time that the scope ID matters. So maybe the answer is just that so maybe it's try write address bytes, span destination out int bytes written out nullable long scope ID, and it gives you back null for non IPv6.
Yep, that's fine.
And then that now tells you which IP address constructor to call.
Yep.
Is that not conflating a whole bunch of things into one?
I mean, the try get address already is, because if you're IPv4, like scope ID is meaningless.
Right, but whether you have a out long question mark scope ID and try write address bytes, just because it comes back as null doesn't mean it's IPv4.
No, it means it's not IPv6.
Yes.
But that you can pass, unless it's a Unix domain socket buffer, you can now pass the span into the IP address read-only span.
Isn't the scope ID also part of the bytes that get written?
I don't think it is. No, that's separate, or we drag it separate, and so I think the address would be really just the bytes of the so be it the 16 bytes for IPv6 address.
Okay.
It's the difference between reading buffer directly and calling the helper method.
Right.
It gave you the subslice and then interpreted the long hanging on the end.
And the socket address already has a family property, right? So if you are not sure what address family it is, you already have a property which tells you if it's v4 or v6. So
is there additional manipulation that happens on the? Is try write address bytes slicing socket buffer to the right portion and doing a try copy to? And if so, should we just have a property that returns you the address portion of the buffer?
Essentially, yes. So we could add a property which gives you the address and it would be nullable for types we don't understand. So let's say, you receive something on Netlink, or people wrote a helper functions, or they use Canvas. So for that one, we don't necessarily know what the range is, so we need to indicate a way saying, hey, we don't know what the address is, or you didn't receive anything, or so we can either return empty span, that would be fine, or that's why it's sort of the try that if this turns out to be address family we don't understand, we don't really know how to do the operation. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like there's 3 pieces of information we're trying to convey. We're trying to convey something about the address, something about the port, something about the scope ID. And
right.
we think those are the only pieces of information that we will ever need to extract? Or that is all the possible information that's extractable?
I think for the types we implement in runtime, that's everything.
Because if that's the case, then to Jeremy's point earlier, you could basically have try get address, or call it something else, try extract or whatever, and have it basically out memory
port,
out memory of byte for the address, and it's literally just a slice on the buffer. Out long scope ID, and out import. Some of those might be null. Well. What's that?
Yep. That would work as well. My guess is whoever needs port would probably need address as well, so it would save you a call. It would work fine.
And then you're not reinterpreting anything. You're literally just slicing the buffer to the right piece and handing that back.
Yep. And the problem is the buffer
isn't there some endianness shift or change
Is there? I thought everything would come through and would be translated by socket to the right endianness.
I think when we convert. Go ahead, Thomas.
Go ahead, Anton.
Yes, so
this is only a byte array, so. Go.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is that IP address, when it works with socket address, then there is some endianness conversion. And I wonder if these APIs should do that.
So I would argue we shouldn't, because it's only byte array, right? So the bytes don't have any endianness, and the interpretation would depend on color. We could do for the port if it gets back int, or we can do that for the scope IP because you get int. But I think if you're just returning back a span of bytes, we basically say this is the raw data which came from the operating system.
And is it enough just to keep the socket buffer and let users do whatever they want for now?
Sorry, I missed the question.
Isn't it enough just to keep the socket buffer for now and let users to do whatever they want to do with it?
Well, the concern that Tomas is highlighting is different operating systems encode the information differently into that buffer. So, like the address family, the port, the address, they're all somewhere in those byte sequence.
So this is really convenient. So yes, we could ignore it, but I felt it'd be useful, and we can use it also in the helpers we do for sockets. We can just expose publicly. We already have the code to do that. So I thought it'd be nice. And hearing all the arguments, I like that's probably the proposal to have one method which gives you 3 outs and basically be done with it for now. It gives you bunch of bytes, it gives you optionally a scope ID for IPv6, and it gives you optionally a port number for IPv4 and IPv6.
Yep, and I think I like Steve suggested, try extract address.
Okay, fine. And the naming I would leave to you guys. I'm miserable with names.
So what would that look like then? Try extract address. What's the signature?
If we were to do it, I think it would base whatever the name is. It would be out memory of byte address out int port, maybe out int question mark port, and out long question mark scope ID.
Would the address be memory or read-only memory?
Good question. I mean, it's going to be the same thing that
would be sufficient. Yeah.
We don't really want people writing through that, but it's the same. It's pointing to the same.
Yeah, but they could figure that out by calling the overlaps. And seeing, oh, great, it's the same as the writable buffer. I just need to index by 3 if they really want to write back through it. But saying read-only memory says, we expect you to read this.
So I think this is a fine API to expose. That said, I'm a little concerned that we're kind of designing it on the fly with one consumer in mind, that is systemnet sockets. And it's not clear to me that for the other use cases that have been described, that the socket address .buffer is insufficient. Like if it's about uniquely identifying a particular caller, it's just socket address buffer slice to 0, size, and now you've got your 8 or 16 bytes that includes the address and the port and whatever else, and that uniquely identifies something. I haven't yet fully comprehended a use case that uses the address, uses the port in some other capacity. I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm sure they do, but I don't know that what we've described is sufficient to fully represent that. So my suggestion is basically we figure out the shape that we think makes the most sense. But to actually ship it, we need to do some more evaluation of consumption, writing out a few scenarios that use it to make sure that it actually meets needs. I'm concerned we're going to add this thing and then turns out it's not actually what was useful.
Yep. And since learning what the address family is, like, so the address family property is itself a p invoke, would we also want that to come back in the extract address? It's going to need to look it up to know how to do the rest of the extraction. It's just a question of, is it worth outing?
Right. At which point we're returning a whole bunch of stuff. Begs the
It's like
question.
maybe we want some kind of like class to describe.
Yeah, you could call it socket address.
So then how about this? Given that we have more issues, how about we just cut the APIs for now and then try to make progress on the other ones?
That's fine.
Let's do that.
Yep, let's do it. Thank you, guys.
Can we, before Tomas goes away though, can we talk about receive from again? Because while I was out, that got reviewed and apparently it got cut, and that made me sad.
So which one is that?
Not that one. There was the thing that built on top of this. I think maybe it was at the bottom.
I saw a comment in the issue, but
scroll up a little bit.
So we talked about it. It's marked as approved, and I think the only one I really like Jeremy's proposal to call it receive socket address. Receive. So
sorry, there was a
preference if you can update it.
There was a link.
Yeah. Issue number is 87397.
Yeah, so if you scroll down to what was approved, it commented out the receive from, which without those, a lot of the value of this issue goes away. You really need to be able to receive these UDP packets without allocating. That's kind of the whole point. And without these APIs, that's lost. So the comment that I saw as to why that was done was because we don't like mutating the socket address, but that didn't make any sense to me because it's just a buffer. And we mutate buffers all the time.
But the problem is it doesn't feel like it's not ergonomically a buffer. It's ergonomically you set some stuff and then now it's an input value.
It is ergonomically a buffer. It's we literally just exposed buffer on this thing.
Part of the discussion was maybe this will make more sense after we talk about some improvements to socket address. We just hit the time boundary because it was the last issue we talked about last time. But
yeah, we certainly ran out of time.
Yeah, I mean, if we can come up with a name for the parameter and like received
I think the
socket address, I think
is Jeremy.
It just needs to sound like it's a thing to fill as opposed to a thing to read, and it really is it's being effectively outed, but it's mutating it in place.
Yeah.
But it looking at the signature, you can't tell if this is a filter on receive from. You can't tell if it's supposed to be receiving the address once you've learned it's mutable. You can't tell if it's both. Sure. And so I think it's just we need to come up with a name, or Levi had suggested a wrapper type pattern to indicate this is getting the buffer, and then the socket address will be updated because you passed in the magic buffer handle.
I'm not sure. I'm not a huge fan of the wrapper. The socket address is the wrapper. It is the wrapper around the buffer. I'm fine coming up with whatever name we think is valuable here, received address or whatever. But killing the API, that's what made me upset.
Yeah. I would also like to receive socket address. I think it would indicate that it's basically something you received, and
yeah. I mean, I think we can drop the particle socket if we put received on it, and then just and we can just say in the docs, this is ignored for input and just receives the address that was written. And then
Yeah, I can
exception,
do that. I can do
you
that.
gave me a socket address whose buffer wasn't big enough.
Yeah, received address sounds great. Is it always updated, Tomas? Is that like today?
Yes.
Okay. So
unless you can have a case when you receive an address and you receive packet from the same sender, therefore it will be still updated, but be identical to what it was before.
Right. Not updating it as an optimization. Logically, it's always coming back as the address that it was received from.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Yep.
I think received address makes sense.
We pass it to operating system. They write whatever they want to, and we basically say, "This is it." We don't do any special magic on it.
Yeah.
Yep. And if somebody passes a read-only reference, then shame on them. And if they use it in a multi-threaded environment, shame on them. So.
Yep.
Certainly, multi-threaded environment, shame on them. What was the first one? A read-only reference?
If they don't realize that socket address is a mutable by other API you would call type, and they have private read-only socket address destination, and then they pass that.
Sure.
Then
I mean, it's already a mutable type, so if they're doing that.
Yeah. But right now the UDP thing is returning you a new one, or the one it returned last time. So it seemed to have been accepting the notion that these look like input, and so it was always returning them instead of mutating them, which is the thing you're trying to fix.
Sounds good.
Sounds good. Let's move on. Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you for humoring me as well.
Should we talk about this one then as well, given that we're still talking about networking?
Sure. So we had a long-standing requests for adding HTTP request error code to HTTP request exception, which Anton just pushed through, and it just got merged. But apparently, again, also while I was out last week or the week before, there was the API review for this, and we ended up adding the enum property to the exception as nullable, which to me is very strange because there's that enum includes an unknown, like 0 is unknown. So there's now two different ways to indicate that you couldn't get an error code for whatever reason. Either the property is null or the property is non-null, but the enum is unknown. And two different ways to do the same thing is not ideal. It's going to lead people to write code to handle both cases, even though they shouldn't have to handle both. There was an argument that was made, I think the reason it was made nullable was trying to differentiate two cases that Jeremy can explain better than I can, because I don't really fully understand them. But from my perspective, you're getting an exception, and either you were able to get an error code or you weren't. And we should just have that be either not have unknown as part of the enum and just have it be nullable, or have unknown and not have it be nullable.
Yeah, my recollection is Levi was the one arguing for the nullability, but to try and represent the difference, it's the socket's HTTP handler could know it's failing, but can't find an enum code that the failure maps to, versus the way an HTTP handler doesn't understand that there's a code here, didn't provide one at all. And so the nullability difference is, is the provider even participating in this error code pipeline? So null is the provider didn't give one, and unknown is the provider gave one, but it didn't map into any of these other enum codes.
And from my perspective, I don't know what the consumer could reasonably do different about those two cases. Whether the provider couldn't tell you, it knew the answer, but it couldn't tell you, or it didn't know the answer. Either way, you don't know the answer.
And from implementation perspective, those cases are also in a way similar, because all the cases where I had to return unknown were very, very weird. Kind of, we feel like we don't know what we are doing, and probably we don't even want the consumers to react to them differently.
I would also hope that if there was a case where Sockets HTTP handler knew an error code but couldn't figure out how to map it into the enum, well, we update the enum with whatever additional value would allow it to appropriately map something.
Right. But
I think we had said that was a breaking change.
Some other person writes a handler that's not the two that we've written, and they have an error that they can't describe in terms of the errors that we've already mapped in.
Yeah.
And then it's unknown.
Yeah. So maybe the answer there would be like we can always map unknown into a different error code if we have to, but we can never take like an existing error and remap it onto something else. So like if we were returning the error value for some set of cases, we can't suddenly cleave some of those off and start returning error code 5 instead, because that could break callers. But if we returned error code 0 for a bunch of things, and then we cleaved some of those off and said, hey, you are now error code 5, then that would presumably be okay.
Yeah,
error code 0 is unknown.
Yeah, I think that's fine. Just to, like, I think it would be fine if we did have this nullable thing going from, okay, I couldn't figure it out, so it's null, to, oh, I figured it out, so now it's a value. I don't think there's any breaking difference between those two things.
So that means that this is an existing exception type, right?
This is an existing exception type of the brand new property.
So this means that we would default the property to unknown instead of nullable?
Yes.
I mean, the purist in me thinks someone might have a case where they care the pipeline doesn't participate in this error code versus the error code made no sense, but I agree that it's probably super marginal.
I still don't understand what that case would be.
I don't have an opinion here.
At the end of the day, like, it doesn't matter to me if, you know, if I ask you for something and you say, I know, but I can't tell you, versus I don't know, doesn't matter to me. I still don't have my answer other than being mad at you.
Yeah, the situation that I tried coming up with is if I don't know any of the names either, so I'll say if you think that 2, 5, and 7 are retriable, then you would say 2, 5, 7, or null are retriable, but not 2, 5, 7, or 0.
Yeah, but I can't think of a situation where you would say null is retriable, but 0 isn't.
Because 0 is they told you it wasn't one of the 3 retriable codes, and null is they didn't tell you what the code was.
Right. Null is it might be one of those codes and it might not. So I'm not sure why I would still be able to retry it.
Exactly. So again, very how you would handle the null would be a very complicated situation. I agree. So
I won't retry either of these cases.
Right. Exactly.
Always kind of obscure. So. And I like nullable.
I'm also fine if we think that there's that null is somehow better, like we could get rid of unknown on HTTP request error and have it always be nullable. That goes against some of our other guidance around enums, but if we think that that was better, fine. My concern is 2 different ways to represent the same thing, such that everyone's going to end up checking both.
Yeah, I mean, really, the distinction is: are you in HTTP handler or not? This equivalence class of do you understand? Is the pipeline you're talking to even participating in trying to populate this error? And if the answer is it's never important to know, then it's never important to know.
You're saying that because WinHTTP handler isn't being updated to populate this?
My recollection from the discussion is WinHTTP handler can't understand how to populate this. So it never will.
Why can't it?
It could be implemented, it's just not a priority right now.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it won't.
At which point, again, I think there's still no difference between null versus unknown.
Fair enough. We can get rid of the question mark. I don't care.
If we get rid of the question mark, then my proposal was also we could just stop there with the property. And then I was also suggesting that we should change the constructor, because if we're saying that the property shouldn't be nullable, then presumably there should just be one way to represent unknown, and that is unknown. So therefore, the constructor argument also shouldn't be nullable. And if the constructor argument isn't nullable, then it can't be where it was positioned in the constructor. It won't compile.
Yeah,
at which point
needs to be defaulted to unknown.
Yeah, sorry, just one comment.
You could do that. Yeah.
In other cases when we have some default value in error code enums, isn't it usually success? So meaning no error. And
but
for
this
case, it has a different semantic. So I still like nullable better.
But there's no error code that means success. Something that would be capable of conveying success would return null, but on the exception, it's something went wrong. That's why you got an exception. So the exception is null or not, is whether or not there was an error. So I don't think that you need a...
yeah, in this case not, but in other cases, like with socket exception, there is socket error success, which basically means no error. So if we base this argument that we always need a default value in the enum based on those examples, then this is kind of different.
Socket error is also a special beast, though, because it's mapped directly to Windows error codes.
Yeah, and I mean, I don't. Again, going with Steve's unknown and null should be just treated equally. We just pop out the question marks and change equal null to equal unknown. Because to me, it's whether we think they're equal, in which case we do that, or we think they're not equal, in which case we ship what we already have.
We also have quick error with 0 success code, and that probably doesn't necessarily map to any.
Sure, but we're not talking about quick error or socket error. We're talking about HTTP error code.
Yeah.
Sorry, HTTP request error. And this is just fundamentally, do we think that null and unknown are the same thing or are different? That's, I think, the only question.
They are the same thing. They are the same thing. I'm just talking about what is the best way to represent it.
They all, like both of the other enums you're talking about, also have a generic, I don't know what the error was, but there was an error. It's just not value 0. So what you're saying is you would like for HTTP request error to have 0 be success, in which case unknown becomes 1.
No, I don't want to have a success error code. I just feel like nullable would be slightly better in this case.
But you still need unknown.
Well.
Because you still have an HTTP.
Yeah. Because that's the guideline expectation.
Well, even if it's not a guideline, someone gives you asks you what's the error, and you say, I don't know, but here's something to represent I don't know. Otherwise, you're saying that every occurrence of HTTP request error has to be nullable. At which point, just put unknown in it.
Okay, I'm fine with unknown as well. Just don't like it that much.
I mean, just from a consumption perspective, what don't you like about it? Someone's going to write code to check this property. They're either checking.
For me, like something nullable is a clear message that the error is not present than a specific
but you got an exception. It's obviously an error.
But the error is not known, so this kind of fact of unknown is kind of feels better if it's null, or if it's an optional or nullable with a missing value. But that might be really just my personal preference, so which is not that relevant here.
Oh, it's relevant. I just disagree. I'm just thinking about the code that I have that I write to consume this. If I write a switch statement, I have a case null versus case unknown. It ends up still have a case for it. It's just what am I calling it? If I write an is expression with pattern matching, it's is null or 47 or whatever, instead of is unknown or 47 or whatever. And otherwise, I'm having to do a check for dot has value. If has value, then read its value versus just using its value and checking for unknown as one of the options. So to me, it's simpler from a consumption perspective for it to be non-nullable.
For switch case, for a classic switch case, definitely, that's true.
Assuming we make it non-nullable for the constructor, the suggestion was leave the constructor as it was, except change it from being nullable to having a default value of unknown.
Yes.
Don't with other places that take where we have like an exception that takes an error code, don't we usually put the error code first?
When this was proposed, it was proposed as an optional extra thing, and so this is just maintaining that.
In the nullable form, yeah.
Like quick exception puts it first. What does socket exception do? Socket exception puts it first. Where else do we have an error code?
Yeah, I mean, we can go for first and a mandatory parameter. It's just the way that it was proposed last time. It was a optional defaulted to null, and
sure. HTTP protocol exception puts it first. Just looking to see where else we have it. What is pipe exception? That doesn't have one.
And it looks like in your suggested change, you've defaulted the message when it previously wasn't defaulted.
Right, we don't have to do that, but I was suggesting doing it since basically then you just construct the exception with the error code and everything can be filled in.
Yep. I mean, yeah, the proposed constructor looks ideal to me. I feel like when I asked when we talked about this previously, if the message was going to be populated based on the error code, the answer was no. And that was why it was leaving the constructor looking the shape that it did. But if we change it to a mandatory first parameter, then we can certainly revisit that decision.
Anton, there's no situation where we, like the messages that are being populated here, they're not they couldn't just be inferred from the error code?
They cannot be inferred, so they are always, like, they are usually more specific than the error code.
So we want to force providing isn't there a constructor that doesn't take a message? Isn't there just a parameterless constructor today?
There are constructors which don't take a message. That is what I was kind of fine with, message being null.
I don't have a strong care. The number of people throwing new HTTP request exception outside of .NET runtime is, I would expect, very small.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So then what's the conclusion in terms of shape?
Looks good to me.
With the error being mandatory and the message being optional?
Right.
Yep.
Ship it.
Thank you all.
All right. Binary formatted resource. Who wants to talk about that?
That's Genevieve.
Yeah.
Oh, maybe it's Levi.
No, I didn't see that Genevieve was here. Awesome. Genevieve
she
is
left.
I guess I'll talk about it then. We went on an obsolescence spree over the past few years with things related to binary formatter, and Genevieve had pointed out offline that we simply missed an API that was binary formatter adjacent. So the request here is to obsolete this. I imagine we can probably, if this room allows it, we can probably use this one of the existing obsolescence codes that we already use for binary formatter, because this is a binary formatter specific API. I would just hate to burn a new obsolescence code based or just for this, or just leave off the code entirely and say screw it. It's just obsolete with no specific code.
I mean, it seems completely reasonable to me. I mean, I don't even know that anybody uses this method. Is this a popular method?
I don't believe so, but I believe you would have the data more than I would.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it. It's like 0.0% on NuGet.org. So
yeah,
0.03%. So there's like 2 people in the world that call this API.
I mean, and those packages probably are the implementation packages, to be honest.
No, because I think I exclude those actually. But yes, I mean, so the question becomes really like, what's the downside, right? There really isn't one, right? We already have obsolete attributes on various of binary formatter related things, right?
Correct. And the thing is, like starting in .NET 8, you won't be able to read this anyway, even if you serialize it, because we've blocked the deserialize method across almost every project type. And in, 14 months or whatever it is, like it's not going to work anywhere. So.
And presumably we have not used as error anywhere, right?
Warnings as error within our own code, you mean?
No, I mean like obsolete has a property you can set that says whether it reports a warning or an error. I don't think we do this anywhere, right?
No, not for binary formatter. We only do it in cases where we need to fail safe, and binary formatter is not one of them.
Right.
And given that the only consumer that we've identified is MS Build, like I said, we can probably avoid using a specific obsolescence code and just ask MS Build, like, pragma suppress it at the call site.
Right.
Because they're not going to suppress this project wide.
That makes sense.
It looks like syslib 11 is an error.
We treat it as an error because of what we do by default in our project templates, but the obsolescence attribute itself is not marked as error. So basically what happens is the obsolescence attribute is marked as warning instead of as error, but when you compile an application, we perform a sleight of hand during compilation, and we inject into your CS proj warnings as errors specifically for syslib 11. And that requires, I believe, a suppression within the project file in order to get that to go away. Was there any other feedback on this?
No, I just marked it as approved because I don't think there's any pushback. I think we should just move on, unless somebody really feels strongly on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the only question really was, do we use the existing binary formatter obsolescence code? And I think yes, seems fine.
Oh, I see.
Given the low usage.
I would agree with that. I think that seems generally desirable, right? Because it's all the same error, basically.
Sorry, so you're suggesting reuse syslib 11?
I would probably recommend this, yeah.
Assuming syslib 11 is the binary formatter code, yes.
Yeah, it is.
And then there's also 50.
Yeah, so syslib 11 was very specifically meant for the binary formatter APIs itself. I don't know of any other case where we've applied it to APIs that were not themselves binary formatter. So this would be the first time we're doing it. Syslib 50 and 51 are general serialization.
Let me rephrase this. We should probably be... Yeah, pick an existing one. Don't cook up a new one. Which one? I don't care, actually. Whatever you feel like is makes the most sense based on what we used before.
Okay, this would be the first time we're using any of those error codes in something that's not directly applied to a serialization type. So it'll be a bit strange, but yeah, we could probably do it.
It basically says binary formatter in the name.
Also, it has the type called pre-serialized resource writer. I don't know, like that seems very serializable to me. I mean,
layering, man.
Layering is hard.
It's a leaky abstraction, man.
All right. Jesus, more networking related stuff.
Thanks.
Oh, yeah, I can speak about this. Maybe there is some miscommunication, but we were like, or especially Carol was worried that there is still no decision on this, and this is probably not an API review concern, but he thought that it's up to you to decide something. However, as far as I remember, the fact is that there will be some document that can help us deciding this. I don't know if it's available already. We just speak with Steven. So what we understood that if R9 will not expose it on the public extensions thing, then we most likely don't want to ship it. And I just got a confirmation that they won't expose it. So most likely the answer is no, although I'm still wondering if such a document is or will be available that can help deciding downloadable packages or questions on downloadable packages.
I mean, we have an existing document that basically outlines when we would ship something down level. I mean, basically what Steven said here is we default always to no, like we don't ship anything by default down level. The only exceptions are cases where we add APIs to packages that already are down level, then you get the down level basically for free in that package. But even in general, like some of the extension stuff is already like cross-compiled for multiple targets where most modern things only go to the latest version of the platform. So as you said, the only reason why we would ship this one type down level would be if R9 uses it in a public API, because they need to be down level, right? So then by extension, we would probably just, for simplicity's sake, make this type available as well. But there was a very short document that I put together that basically just said what I just said, which is basically this is how we evaluate things for R9 specifically for down level. And so yeah, since there was no new data, like that's kind of the decision that we landed on. So I would almost just close this issue and say like we don't plan on doing this because we don't have evidence that it needs to be public.
Yeah, thank you.
I have that evidence, by the way.
Okay.
I realize I'm coming in here late, but I have received multiple requests from internal partners to make this type available down level. And I believe I put those partners in touch with NCL. Is there some kind of miscommunication here?
Most likely, yes. We didn't hear from these partners yet.
Okay. I will follow up with you offline then.
So then leave it open for now, or like what do we do?
Let's leave it up. Yeah. Let's leave it.
And probably remove blocking then.
Yeah. All right, let me do the other one then. Let me just, because otherwise it doesn't show up in the review thing. So let me just push this back and then just say, all right. Alrighty. Who wants to talk about this one?
Hi there. So yeah, there's several different JSON-centric convenience-based extension methods that exist in system, net, HTTP, JSON, NuGet package. And I'm proposing a few new ones that would expose the IAsync enumerable for streaming endpoints. So this would be for just basically adding a few new APIs that would kind of delegate out to the JSON serializer, deserialize async enumerable. Sorry, my dog's back barking.
So I'm not an expert in any of this, but so how would that generally work? So the idea is that you would just keep enumerating that endpoint effectively one page at a time logically, or what does it do?
Yeah, so like if you scroll down a little bit, it shows like the consumption pattern for it. So API usage. So imagine you've got like a time series and you've got a streaming endpoint. You could have an HTTP client that you could use this extension method to essentially stream from that endpoint and get the deserialized, materialized type.
So that part makes sense to me, but like the idea, I mean, because it says streaming, that kind of implies it's not just one request, right? It's just an ongoing communication between the client and the server, right?
Or is it a long returned JSON array with slow write?
I think it's probably the latter of the two. Because I think it's a single request.
It's definitely a single request.
Yeah, okay, yep.
And then the return is open square bracket and then a bunch of time series values, and this is iterating over the contents of the array. So it's only applicable when the target is itself an array returning thing. It's not doing JSON fragment interpretation or anything weird.
Correct.
But if an object has already been fully transmitted, then it will read the response and let you process that while waiting on the next packets that have the end of the next object.
It basically has the exact same semantics of the JSON serializer to deserialize async enumerable, and it's just bolted onto these helper methods so that you, don't need to create your own HTTP request message.
Fair enough.
Yeah, and I was proposing just doing it for get, potentially post, but certainly not put or patch or delete. There was a comment towards the bottom where someone was saying for parity to add post, patch, and delete, but I don't think I like that.
It doesn't seem very common, and if people do need that, they can write their own extension method, I think.
Yeah, I agree.
So was this an area for put? Like you stream to the server then?
No, that would be if any of those verbs were to actually return a body, which is not really standard.
So put, patch, and delete are effectively out of scope for this proposal.
Yeah. Okay, right. That makes more sense now to me. Okay.
Yeah. And dumb question, but why are all the URIs nullable? What does null URI mean?
I think it just means you'd use the one that is the what is the base URI that you pass into the client, I suppose.
Right. Yeah, that was for API parity with the existing convenience-based functionality that exists. Like, so there's like get from JSON async.
Yeah, I mean, I assumed you were matching the existing one, but the fact that the client has if I don't tell you a URL, here's the URL to use is special.
Very special. Yeah, so it's proposed for the HTTP client JSON extensions, and then for HTTP content JSON extensions as well.
So how much work is in those bodies, by the way? So if we say somebody wants to do it for, let's say, post, what would they have to do?
So if you scroll down a tiny bit, I did a details summary right there. Up a little bit. Right, potential. There you go. Yep.
I see. So well, I was thinking, like, if we don't do it, like, I guess if you have these methods here, can't you do that by basically writing an extension method that does post, gets the body, and then basically does body dot one of those? Like, you wouldn't have to implement this entire thing from scratch if you wanted to provide, like, this guy here, not for post, but for not for get, but for post. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Sort of. Yeah, I'm still not convinced post is necessary. I guess I'd defer to Eric. What do you think?
I mean, most places I've seen deserialize async enumerable be useful in the context of HTTP calls. It's like 99% get calls.
Right.
Conceivably you could see it in post, but yeah, I think we're just adding it for insurance. But
I mean, the only reason I'm asking is because if there's a workhorse method somewhere, right, then you can just say, write your 3-line extension method yourself, dispatch to the other one, right, and then then I think it's fine to not have it if we think that, oh yeah, there's a decent chance that somebody might need it, we just don't want to do it, and then they have to write 50 lines of code, then that's bad.
I think the workhorse in this case would be the HTTP content extensions.
Yeah, that's what I've thought. And so like as long as you can dispatch to those,
Right.
and it's just you just have to do the orchestration for getting the message and then doing the thing, I think that's totally fine.
Yeah, I would say that most of the work would be crafting your own HTTP request message, which I would say is a feature, not a bug. I much prefer crafting my own HTTP request messages as opposed to using these accelerators myself.
You like it hard, huh? No, I mean, makes sense. I mean, I can understand why you would say that. Yeah, then I think we're on the same page. Anybody else?
Assuming all the parameters are matching the style for the type, seems good to me.
All right, then. Sorry, what did you just say? I missed that when I was typing.
That assuming that all of the parameters are consistent with everything else on the type.
Yeah, I think I checked that earlier and it looked like it.
Yeah, they are.
All right, then done. Thank you. Then one last one.
Yeah, I guess I can take that. So this has been a long-standing issue, usability issue with system.json. Effectively, the JSON serializer options class, unlike what its name suggests, it's not just a simple configuration class. It's actually it defines the context for all the caches that the serializer will be using. And as such, creating a new instance on every invocation is extremely expensive. It was even more expensive pre.NET 7. In .NET 7, we added some mitigations that made this a bit less of an issue, but we still think it is an issue. And the fact is that many users it is a pervasive pattern that users will be creating a fresh JSON serializer options instance every time they try to serialize a value. And we know for a fact that this is creating a lot of performance issues in their application. So this effectively proposes that we introduce a new analyzer that effectively warns on some of the cases where we detect that this is happening. I'm including a few examples in this proposal, although after some conversation offline with Stephen, we kind of figured that kind of catching everything would be expensive since we would need to do some kind of flow analysis. And instead, we might just want to catch the very simple cases where you just have some variable bound to a new JSON serializer options constructor and warn of that if it's being passed to a JSON serializer method downstream.
Basically catch the easy stuff and we can add in as much as we need to over time, but the easy things are easy and are probably the 90% case.
Yep.
So I have a devil's advocate question. Let's say that I want to write a very simple console application that just serializes or deserializes something, and then I act on the data that I've deserialized. Does that mean that I'm going to receive a warning whenever I try to use JSON serializer.deserialize if I haven't created like a static for my options?
If we marked this by default as warning, generally these are info level.
So it will show up in my build, but it won't block the build and won't produce a warning.
No, info doesn't show up in a build. Info shows
Okay.
up as a blue squiggle in the IDE.
Got it. Okay.
If we made it a warning, then it would show up in your build, and it would block your build if you had warning as error enabled.
Sure. Yeah, but on a console app, like I wouldn't do that though. Okay, cool.
This is effectively a performance rule.
Yeah.
And we pretty much never make perf rules anything more than info. We reserve warning and error. We basically make everything that we know, like you're going to blow up at runtime. We make that a warning or error.
Yeah, sure, and that makes sense. Because yeah, the goal of this was just to ask, like, hey, we're not making it more difficult for somebody to write like a very quick console utility, and it sounds like the answer is no.
Right. It'll show up as additional information in the IDE, and so yeah, you might say, oh, it's noise in that capacity, but that's true for every perf rule we add.
Sure.
Perf is a category, right? I'm not making this up, right?
Yeah, that's true.
Sweet.
Thank you.
I think we might have time to do some more. I think that's the one we just did, right? Yep. Any take us on this one?
Sure. I don't have much context other than we added async disposable to text writer. We didn't add it to text reader. And the request is to add it to text reader as well. We didn't add it to text reader because, well, we added the text writer because it's very common to need to do flushing and stuff like that as part of cleanup, and flushing often involves I/O. It's a lot. We don't have any built-in scenarios where there's meaningful flushing or I/O happening on closing a reader, but you could imagine such a case, I guess. So that's where the request comes from.
Presumably, if we do it, we should implement dispose async according to the async dispose pattern that we.
Yeah, I think we do it exactly as we do it on the writer.
Did the writer do it right, or did it use a virtual?
Well, I think we should match however we did it on writer.
Yeah, I agree. We should be locally consistent.
It does it as a virtual on the writer. We should do it as a virtual on the reader.
It's just public virtual beta task dispose async then?
Yeah, this is what it looks like. Here's a link. This is what it looks like on the writer. The reader would do the same thing.
Yeah.
Yep, seems easy enough.
I'm curious, is there mention anywhere what they're doing?
That requires that?
Yeah. Like stream reader doesn't do anything and it's disposed that does I/O, right? No. I guess it calls close on the underlying stream, so maybe that could do some I/O.
Yeah, like if you have an SMB file or a file open from SMB, that'll issue a network close, but I don't know that you know that it's an async operation.
Generally, you would want that to be asynchronous anyway, because you don't care if it returns.
Sorry, I mean, I don't know if what we have is a file handle. I don't know if file handle has async close in the OS. I think we call close, and then I don't know if they do blocking on the SMB call or if they're just like, yeah, it's fine, move on.
Yeah.
It's an optimization from this point to tell the server to close its handle, so you don't care if it happens.
Yep.
Yeah, so while I/O can happen on closing a read handle, I don't know that it ever manifests.
I guess it would happen if you opened a stream for reading and writing, you wrote some stuff to it, you wrapped a reader around it, you close the reader, and you still want your written data to get flushed. I guess.
Or if you derived any of these types yourself and issued an async logging request on dispose that you read or wrote in bytes. Be weird, but yeah, I don't know. I don't care.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like we're just generally like all like, yeah, it seems fine, but nobody's excited about it.
I mean, I don't like that we have to choose between global consistency and local consistency, and I don't like that there's not a scenario, but
I mean, I can
care.
kind of like, to me, one of the simple arguments is just being able to do this, right? Because it's like, if you're a user, like, it's already hard enough to understand when you use async. And if you tell people like, oh, for I/O you use it, but then half the stuff works with it, the other half doesn't, it's not easy, right? And yeah, as we said, you can, especially with these abstract types, you can always compose something that would benefit from it, right? So it seems generally like not a bad pattern to follow. But yeah. All right, then I guess this is it for today. Unless we want to do, we can probably do this one here if we really wanted to.
The spans to null one, unsafe one, like those are pretty fast.
Yeah, this one should be pretty quick. Well, I'm not sure about the comparing spans to null one, but the other two.
So what is the other two? So this one here, the unsafe.
The two you just opened, yeah. So we expose on the unsafe class is address greater than and is address less than. And this is just proposing adding is address greater than or equal to and is address less than or equal to. For this shows up in particular when you're using ref arithmetic, which we have our separate feelings about. But if you're doing it and you need less than or equal to, you don't have it, you end up doing some sort of mental gymnastics to figure out, oh, if I do not greater than. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I agree. I've done this before too.
Sure.
Seems fine. So this one, we don't want to talk about this one here though. It's easy enough. Yep, looks like something that.
Yes, adding a named zero value to a thing that didn't have one seems like goodness. None is the recommended answer for a 0 for flags.
So my only question is, when do you get this? Just the default value?
If it's just well, there is a concept of a normal file.
Oh yeah, this one, I see this. Oh, I see. So this, yeah, I see now. Okay. Okay, fair enough. Yep.
Yeah, like, what attributes does this file have? None. What's it going to toString as? 0. Like, make it read only. Now it says read only.
No, but I'm a little confused. How is this different than file? So file attributes.normal is a thing.
No, I think the difference here is it's not about a file that has no attributes, right? It's like for this particular example here is you have this guy here where you say which attributes do you do you want to filter out? And the answer is none. Like I care about all of them.
I see. Okay.
Right, so it's less about the thing that files and directories would probably, they would never be truly zero, because they would at least say I'm a directory versus I'm a file, right? But I guess for scenarios like this where you say which ones do you not care about, it's like, well, I really need to say none.
Mm-hmm. So here's the thing, right? If what is that? Enumeration options.
Mm-hmm.
So none makes sense in enumeration options, but if you have a file info and you get its attributes, is the existence of none going to confuse you? Because a file that you read back from the operating system will not have attributes none. It will have attributes normal.
I mean, you're asking, are people confused by zero value on flag enums?
No. So what I'm saying is I don't think it will actually return a zero value today if you call something like file info.getAttributes.
Sure.
So what I'm saying is ignore the fact that it's a flags enum. We're introducing a brand new value to the enum, which might draw people toward using that instead of using the thing that they expect it to be, which is normal.
I mean, that's true. I mean, I think the question is what happens when you create a file and you pass in attributes none? What happens? Do we throw? Presumably we say that's not valid, right?
Is that even something you can do today?
Well, I mean, minimally you can always say, file dot set attributes, right?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out where that
And,
API
I mean, today you can already pass in zero, right? So whatever we do today, when you pass in a literal zero, like we would just keep doing this when you say file attributes dot none, right? So yes, I mean, it might confuse people that they don't get the value back, but that's the general problem with enums. Is like depending on where they're used and where they're returned, they may only deal with a subset of values, right? That's not specific to these attributes.
Levi, is your question more that someone without reading the docs might say, I want to know if this is a normal file, so I'm going to write file.getAttributes equals file attributes.none?
Yes. As opposed to file attributes.normal.
I mean,
basically they'll stop looking at the values once they see that none is an option.
Correct. And then their application will do the wrong thing. I mean, in testing,
then when they attach a debugger, it'll say is normal equal to none, and they'll go, oh, that's weird, and then they'll call it normal.
Yeah. It just seems like an unnecessary peta failure that we're introducing, or what is presumably an edge case scenario.
I mean, in fairness, I don't think normal is the thing I would have been looking forward to either. Like, unless you said it, I would have had to read the docs for this.
Well, IntelliSense, when you did dot in IntelliSense, normal would have been the only thing that would ever make sense to you when it came up in the list.
Well, I just usually go for not content indexed, but I guess. Honestly, none of them make sense to me. I probably would have said, like, I don't know. I would have probably just attached the debugger and see what I get back.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can agree that there's probably some cases where somebody is checking to see if something is normal, and they check none, and then, yeah, test your code. Sorry.
Yep. Honestly, I don't know what happens when you set attribute 0 today.
Kaboom.
I'm looking at various code that uses file attributes. WPF has a line, new directory info, directory info.attributes equals file attributes.normal. Isn't file attributes.normal a file, not a directory?
Yes.
So what does that do?
Normally it ors in directory for you.
Yeah.
The directory and normal are different bets. So I think it would be a normal directory, whatever that means.
I guess, yeah. I mean, I would either expect it to fail or just give you back directory at the end. I mean, the good news is WPF doesn't run on Linux. On Linux, it will probably create a file.
Anyway, yeah. So if I'm the only person with this concern, then like please feel free to overrule me. It's just I'm wondering if we're making, in a nutshell, I'm wondering if we're making a common use case less obvious in order to make an uncommon use case more usable.
I mean, do you have an alternative name?
I don't know what the use case is where you check normal. Like normally you're checking whether certain bits are set. Let's see, file attributes and read-only does not equal 0. File attributes and hidden does not equal 0. What's the situation where you're checking for normal?
I mean, checking might be the wrong thing, but like it's more like when you set attributes, you want to reset everything to just a file, right? Only clear basically everything else. I guess at that point you would say set attributes, file attributes dot normal, I suppose.
I would not be surprised if you set it to 0 if the right thing just happened.
That might be true too, actually.
You're very trusting, but yes.
It's probably
my nature. I'm an optimist.
I mean, on Windows, probably the right things are going to happen. On Linux, you just get a thing that nobody can read anymore.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, the Linux implementation never reads the normal bit, so none in normal would be the same in set attributes.
Interesting.
Because it only looks to see, have you set hidden, and have you set read only, and have you set user read.
Interesting.
Those are the only bits it tests at all.
It's the bit. I mean, it's not coincidental that it maps to what I just said since I wrote this code, but it's the bit testing thing that I just talked about, right? You're checking to see whether certain flags are set and you're mapping those accordingly. And normal is meaningless. So
yeah.
Yeah, if you're using normal, you wouldn't be doing it as a bit check. You would be doing it as a straight up equality comparison.
I am a
little
surprised that we aren't throwing for reparse point integrity stream, encrypted, compressed, archive, etc., since we can't handle any of those, but that ship has sailed. Unless the Windows one has the same, like, if I can, I can, and if I can't, I don't. Like, I don't know what happens if you set encrypted on something on FAT32.
Probably blue screens.
Didn't they change the color and it's not blue anymore? Or am I just thinking of the Xbox?
On Insiders, it's green.
Oh, okay.
I think on Windows, I have to check. I think on Windows, it just gets passed down to Windows, and we didn't want to try and like emulate the OS in the .NET layer. So we allow whatever flags and we interpret the ones we know about.
Yep. Emo, I like the trademark symbol at the end of that. That really sealed the deal. Seals the not a big deal, as it were.
I mean, that's how that goes, right? No,
yes.
No, it's legally binding.
Yes. Perfect.
So once I send the email, we will find out what Outlook does with special characters. It might explode your inbox.
Except for you're using like the fancy trademark symbol instead of the one that's a more typical like superscript.
I know.
Because Unicode defined both of them, because of course it did.
What is the Klingon symbol for trademark? It's just you get killed. There's no
basically, yeah. Yeah, it's a spear through your chest.
So
we could try the spans no one. I don't remember what it is.
I think it was, if I remember vaguely, it's like the problem is depending on how you write the comparison, it produces surprising results.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a fair assumption that the Unicode universal encoding likes redundant things multiple times.
Yep. This isn't the same thing as comparing a read-only span of char to a string, correct?
No, I think this is the problem where we have a span because null is not a value type. You basically get the wrong implementation and then ends up basically saying something is not null.
Shouldn't this fail to compile? Because historically what it would do is box the value type.
No, so it's the other way around. No, you don't use the equality operator on span. What happens is the span gets implicitly converted to an array, to a null array, and then that thing.
But spans can't implicitly go to arrays.
Sorry, maybe it's the other way around then. The array gets converted to an empty span. No, sorry, it's the other way around. Yeah, so the array gets converted to an empty span, and then we compare the null span to an empty span, and then we say it's not null. So our implementation of the implicit operator will give you a different result from.
I'm confused as to why the line if span equal the literal null compiles.
Because there's
the compiler has.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Tanner.
Oh, the compiler has always allowed comparing structs to null, and that's a bug that now has a warning wave, and it would constant compile down to null. But in the case of span in particular, null implicitly there's only one valid conversion to span to most span of T, and that is from T array, and so null is interpreted as a T array implicitly converted to an empty span, and so null compares equal to empty span.
Yeah.
Okay, because I thought that what it did for value types when you compared it to the literal null in the past was box them into object, and then it said the box that I just created is non-null, so it always returned false. But it did so expensively.
Yeah, I think the problem is there's an implicit conversion from a null literal to a span, right? That's because we basically made the T array constructor. Okay. So the T array implicit operator.
Yeah, I thought that I didn't think that it would have found the implicit converter off of the null literal because it's a typeless value. But I guess if there's only one candidate, it's not ambiguous.
Yep. Yep, it's only typeless when it's ambiguous. Otherwise, it's target type to the most likely value.
Okay, and so then we simply think we should add an analyzer that finds a span being compared against the null literal and gives a warning distinct from the warning that the compiler is going to give when comparing a value type to null in the same era? Or do we think this has just already been subsumed by the compiler?
Well, there is no warning today. Or the reason that Tanner gave, like this isn't being treated as a typical value type comparison against null.
Sorry, but I thought, oh, that's true. Because it found a way out. It's not hitting the okay. Okay, I get it.
And the quirkiness ultimately is because we both do and do not simultaneously treat empty span from default span as the same. Because for unless you're doing weird things, you typically don't get to have a valid ref with a 0 length. But that is definitely possible to encounter. And so we probably should have differentiated, but we just didn't.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I own some of the code that needs to distinguish between the empty span and the null span.
Yeah.
Jan gets sad every time I have to bring it up.
No, but it's the same.
So how do we can we detect this without going to the syntax tree?
Yes, you should be able to. I'm pretty sure there's a representation for literals. So you will be able to tell this is not literal.
Yeah.
Okay. We can get that from the expression tree.
You get this from the bound tree. From what I think they call it the operation tree in the analyzer context.
Okay, so we'll be looking for op equals with span or read-only span where the sister argument is a coerced null literal. Because
Yeah.
default we need to let work, because default is, I mean, we can suppress it in the cases that I needed to make the distinction, but equal default is a thing.
Yeah. What does it? And I think this was something different, right? This would be
Equal default asks, do you have a ref to null?
right.
Right.
Which happens to be what equal null does. Just equal default is not turning null into the null array and then coercing the null array into a span and then asking the question. It's functionally equivalent to that. It's just doing less work.
So that said, could we actually flip this on its head and say, if we see an equality operator being done against span or read-only span, and one side of that equality operator does not explicitly say the word default, it is a warning. Because this was probably not what you wanted.
Right.
Because that rule would catch comparisons against null, it would match comparisons against strings, it would match comparisons against other spans, because a lot of people probably think comparisons against spans are comparisons against their contents. But that is not the case. So if we just say, like, screw it, the only thing that we allow through the system without a warning is a comparison against literally the letters D, E, F, A, U, L, T.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's probably plenty of users, especially power users, who are using the equality to actually check if two spans are reference equal. That is their the tracked birefs are equivalent. That it's going to potentially be problematic.
I agree that
And I
would be
think that's what
problematic for power users, but they could disable it, because I think the typical user is going to run into problems more than power users would.
If we did it early enough, then we could definitely get the feedback on whether it's problematic and we need to scope it more.
Yeah, I agree. This isn't a .NET 8 issue, is it? Emo, can you scroll up? A milestone, okay.
I mean, like, it's an analyzer. If we approve it, it gets done when it gets done.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, no, but Tanner has a good point, though, that we don't want to do something so late that we just make it painful for power users, right?
I mean, we ship analyzers much more frequently than we ship the full product. Like we ship them in the SDK, but they also ship as a NuGet package every few months. So.
Well, so what did people think of that? I know that Tanner has concern about power users, but what do people think of the overall, like, just literally block everything that's not a default comparison? Block it with a warning, and you could always suppress it or turn the warning off.
I mean, we could just, if we're doing that route, we could just basically say don't do it at all, and users who want to check for default should be using span.isEmpty. Just block, basically soft deprecate the equality comparison on span.
I would be fine with that too, because Jeremy's probably one of 5 people in the world who really cares about equals default. Sorry, Jeremy.
If the answer is we warn because you probably don't want to do it, and then we just suppress the PKCS12 password computing function of, like, yes, this is actually what it needs to do, then sure.
I mean, I'm okay with that so long the user knows what the fix is, right?
But I think if they said null, that doesn't actually make sense against the span, but there is a default span.
Yeah.
Equal default is the same as saying equal read-only span of t dot default, just it uses a lot fewer characters.
Yeah, I think the dot is default is, I think, what people understand. I think if they expected a content comparison with a string, for example, then clearly they meant dot sequence equal, right?
Yeah, well, the thing that makes that particularly difficult is that we tell people to think of things like romchar and rajchar as replacements for string, but the equals API doesn't do what you think it does at that point.
Right.
And now we're telling people to use, like, rombyte and rosbyte as equivalents of UTF-8 string, and they still don't behave in string-like fashions. So
Yeah, and do we need to do this for memory as well?
if we did it on span, we should do it on memory, yeah.
Because I think it'll have the same coercive behavior.
Well,
it
being soft deprecation of the equality operator, I believe, is what you were getting at. We've also lost quorum.
Oh, we want to. I missed that we changed to saying we just or give a warning on equal equal. Because we don't have is default. We have is empty, which is insufficient to answer the question.
Right. So keep in mind that we're out. We don't have quorum anymore. But yeah, the thing that came up at the end was basically saying like nobody should ever be calling equals on span. It almost certainly doesn't do what you think it does. And if you have read the docs and you know that you're doing something correct, then suppress the warning.
But it does exactly. Sorry, it does exactly what I think it does. Which
right,
is
but that's because
asking, are you the same pointer and same length?
Yeah, but that's because you're intimately familiar with like what span was intended to be.
But that's the same as if you use it. So ignore that string is a special kind of span source. Yeah. Array equal array is not content equal. It's is this literally the same array? And that's what span equal offers is this literally the same span?
Yes, but in practice, what we've been telling people to do is to think of it as like a string equivalent. And now people
we've maybe-ish said that for Ross char, but Ross types that aren't char, like, so maybe it's maybe it's this warning is only applicable when the span is over char.
Maybe. Well, Ra's byte is UTF-8 string, right?
No, because I live in a sane world where we didn't do that.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Because char array equal char array doesn't do content equality. It just does reference equality. So if we say span is like array, then equal has, you already know what it does. It's when they think it's like string is when things get weird.
The problem is we've literally told people to think of it as both simultaneously.
Yes.
So what's wrong with that? It just means it depends.
Right. Well, it doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah, I know what you mean. So are we in agreement of what I just summarized here? Is that a fair summary?
But there is no is default on span.
Oh, sorry, there isn't?
It would be is.
There's is empty, but that tells you the length is 0. It doesn't check if the ref is null or non-null.
Which, in fairness, most people don't care. If you care, you're already kind of in an edge case scenario. They're legitimate, but they are uncommon.
I mean, we do have this default on other things. Immutable array has one, for example.
There are only basically two places that should ever care. One is a marshalling boundary, which the Git. So you have marshalling boundary and the PFX spec. Those are basically the only two cases that care.
For immutable array, the cases are usually in initialization. Like you basically want to check did I already compute the span, right? If I did, then empty is a valid output, right?
Well, isn't immutable array a struct anyway?
Yeah, but it's basically the same thing, right? It's basically a struct wrapper around an array, right? And so there's this case of like, is the array actually null or is the array empty, right? And those are different things.
Well, yeah, but I mean, it makes sense because like your backing field could be null. Like you literally were not initialized, yeah.
Yeah, but that's the same for span, right? Does the ref point to something or is the ref effectively a null pointer, right? Like there's a difference between pointing to an empty and pointing to nothing, right?
I feel like the get pinnable pattern on span and what the fixed statement does is if length is 0, it gives you null, which is at least the crypto segment of Win32. Like we then have to go marshal our way around that because it is 100% not what we wanted to do.
Yeah,
right.
It's because we want the return value of get pinnable reference to always be do referenceable.
Right.
Right. But there are Win32 functions that check, was the thing null before they bothered checking, did you say a length of 0? And so we end up in cases where we have to pass non-null, 0. And generally the answer is the crypt32 segment of Windows is unique in that space. But there are probably other cases where people have needed to do similar working against the marshaller. But
I mean,
yeah.
So it seems to me like if you want to really go down the path of like basically saying you should never have comparisons written like this, I think we should add a method like this default, and then just tell people like you can always write it in a way that it doesn't trigger the thing. Or we could say we don't do it.
Those probably aren't. The analyzer, assuming that this is we make an analyzer for it, the analyzer would see the 4 patterns against all TFMs, and his default would only be added on a new TFM. So the thing that it tells you to work around is not applicable if you're on an older TFM.
You can always suppress in that case.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. I mean, it's we added a this is explicitly my intent API and suppress it if you have to. I'm just saying there's not a like everybody can just switch to using as default.
Right.
So
yeah, that's
the number of people who would be inconvenienced by needing to add a suppression, I think, is low enough
that it doesn't matter.
Where I don't feel too bad. But I do. If we wanted to kind of limit the blast radius, then what Jeremy had mentioned about having this analyzer run only for RAW's char might be the good first step.
I mean, I guess. I mean,
that was
the example that we gave happened to come up with strings. That's fair, I suppose. But is it really unreasonable to have the same problem when you deal with byte arrays?
It depends on how people think of byte. It depends on how people think of RAW's byte. If people think of RAW's byte as being equivalent to array of byte or array of anything, then it's not a problem. If people are encouraged to think of them as string equivalents, then it is a problem.
But why do you think it's not a problem for arrays? Because I mean, like if I convert a code base that uses T array right now or a byte array right now to, span or rows of byte, don't I have the same code that is already written that compares it to null and it gives me not the right result?
It would work just fine, actually. Because if you cast a null array into a RAW's byte or a RAW's T, like the RAW's T is going to point to nothing, right? So comparing it against null, like, it still wraps a null array. Have fun. It will still give you the correct answer.
Yes, equal null and equal default are functionally the same. It just goes through a conversion operator.
Yeah. The thing that changes is when you're trying to compare contents. So if you're trying to say like equals empty string or empty string U8 or something like that, that will fall down.
So you're saying if I change this here to bytes, it would actually produce different outcomes?
No, it'll produce the same outcome. I'm just saying that people at the moment aren't tempted to write the type of code that could trip them up, because the thing that they're going to be converting from is not something where they could have gotten tripped up in the first place. So like if I have code right now which relies on string and I convert it to RAW's char, like it's entirely possible that I call things like equals or dot equals or whatever inside my original code base, and then I literally just do a search and replace string with RAW's char and I'm good to go. Except for there are subtle problems which I don't discover until I run my code. If my code were originally byte array instead of string, like dot equals and equals never worked in the first place because they always only ever did reference checks, never content checks. So I would never have, my before code would not have looked like that pattern, which meant that I wouldn't have those things tripping me up after the conversion.
That's the thing I don't understand. Like, to me, it's still the same problem. It's like you basically still say, like, originally the intent was, is empty span uninitialized? And then you have some code underneath it, right? That says, if it's null, then do something, right? And now this never gets triggered because it's never going to be null. So so this null gets always triggered, basically, in this case.
Yeah, I mean, it is still true that it is equal to the uninitialized state, or rather, like it's the zero fill state, but because null turned into an array, turned into a span that then looked the same as the default span.
Right.
I think that I don't know that we have evidence that says you wanted, or that we should throw away equal equal. Like, the thing here is saying, hey, this compares to null when that actually doesn't make any sense. We fixed the general warning for structs, but span is sneaking by because it has an implicit conversion to array. And then it's calling that one. But you still didn't mean null. You might have meant default, but you didn't mean null. And
which is precisely why I think limiting it to a char doesn't make sense to me. I would say that's a general problem with spans, no matter what the T is.
Sorry, I meant for the operators. Like, I don't think that I don't know that there's any justification in saying using the operators against span is wrong. They do what they do.
They do what they do.
Sure.
People depending on what the before code looked like. If you're mutating your code to go from not span into span, depending on what the before code looked like, the operators could end up introducing behavioral changes that you did not intend.
If your source type was an array, then everything works the same. If your source type was string, then it doesn't.
Correct.
And that is true, but that's been true for 8 years.
And people still make mistakes.
Sure, but the thing that was being, I mean, we can say that the question was wrong. The question is, should we warn on span compared to the null literal? And the answer was, maybe it shouldn't have supported equal equal in the first place. And it's like, I think that answer is massively overreaching. I think it's fine to warn against the comparison to the null literal. I wouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater and get rid of the operators, though.
All right, then let's do this.
Is it actually needs work, or do we need more?
No, I'll flip it back.
this?
I just have to have a status change, otherwise it doesn't show up in the notes.
Okay.
All right, then I'll see you guys on Thursday, I suppose.
Awesome.
Bye bye.
Zane.